The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine courtyard of Windsor Castle as guard Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. At 28 years old, Thomas had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years, and he knew the routine by heart. Every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every movement precise and measured. Thomas wasn't just any guard. He had earned his position through years of dedicated service in the British Army, including 2 tours in Afghanistan where he had distinguished himself as a leader and protector. His commanding officers had noted his exceptional patience, his ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, and his unwavering respect for duty above all else. These qualities had made him perfect for palace duty, where patience wasn't just a virtue but an absolute necessity. The tourists had started arriving early that Tuesday morning in October. The autumn air was crisp, and the changing leaves created a picturesque backdrop that drew visitors from around the world. Thomas stood at his assigned post near the main entrance, watching his families pose for photos. Children pointed excitedly at the guards, and tour groups gathered to hear stories about the castle's 800-year history. He had learned to become almost invisible while remaining completely visible. Tourists would approach to ask questions, take photos, or simply stare in wonder at the traditions he represented. Some would try to make him laugh or break his composure. Others would show genuine respect and curiosity about his role. Thomas had developed an internal catalog of every type of visitor he might encounter, and he prided himself on handling each situation with the same professional dignity. What Thomas didn't know was that this particular morning would test every ounce of that patience and professionalism in ways his military training had never prepared him for. The first sign of trouble came at approximately 10:30, when a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the visitor parking area. The car was expensive, immaculately maintained, and carried diplomatic plates that immediately caught Thomas's attention. From his position, he watched as a woman emerged from the passenger seat, and, even from a distance, everything about her screamed privilege and expectation. Margaret Worthington was 52 years old, impeccably dressed in what was clearly a designer outfit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move despite the October breeze, and her makeup looked as though it had been applied by a professional. She wore the kind of jewelry that whispered rather than shouted wealth, and she moved with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. Margaret came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so many generations that the origins of their fortune had become family legend rather than documented history. She had married into even more money, becoming the wife of a successful businessman who had built his empire through a combination of inherited wealth and ruthless business practices. Together, they moved in circles where influence was currency and connections opened doors that remained closed to ordinary people. What made Margaret particularly dangerous was her absolute belief that the rules didn't apply to her. She had spent decades having those rules bent, broken, or simply ignored because of her family name, her husband's business relationships, and her own carefully cultivated network of influential friends. She had never encountered a situation where her status didn't immediately resolve any inconvenience or obstacle. As Margaret approached the castle entrance, Thomas noticed her companion, a nervous-looking man in his 30s who was clearly struggling to keep up with her determined pace. This was James, her personal assistant, who had learned through painful experience that the best way to survive working for Margaret was to anticipate her needs and smooth her path before she even realized there might be obstacles ahead. "Mrs. Worthington," James said, slightly out of breath, "perhaps we should check with the visitor services desk about the private tour arrangements." Margaret waved him off dismissively. "James, really? Do you think I need to stand in line like some common tourist? I spoke with Lord Patterson just last week at the charity gala, and he assured me that accommodations would be made." Thomas watched this exchange with growing interest. He had heard variations of this conversation before, though usually not delivered with quite such imperious confidence. He began mentally preparing for what his training had taught him to recognize as a developing situation. The normal visitor entrance to Windsor Castle involved a straightforward process. Tourists purchased tickets, went through security screening, and joined designated tour groups. There were, of course, special arrangements for VIPs, diplomatic visitors, and other distinguished guests, but these required advanced coordination and proper documentation. Thomas knew the procedures by heart because part of his job was ensuring that security protocols were followed without exception. Margaret approached the main entrance with the kind of confidence that suggested she expected doors to simply open before her. She had done this before at other exclusive venues, though never at a working royal residence with the level of security that Windsor Castle required. "Excuse me," she called out to Thomas, her voice carrying the tone of someone addressing a servant rather than a representative of the crown. "I need to speak with someone about arranging immediate access to the private royal apartments. I'm Mrs. Margaret Worthington, and I have connections with the royal household staff." Thomas maintained his position and professional demeanor, though internally he was already assessing the situation. His training had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate VIP visitors and those who simply believed they deserved special treatment. Everything about this woman's approach was raising red flags. "Good morning, madam," Thomas replied with perfect courtesy. "All visitor arrangements need to be coordinated through the official visitor services office. They'll be able to assist you with any special requests or verify any prior arrangements." Margaret's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. In her world, mentioning the right names and displaying the right attitude was usually sufficient to bypass normal procedures. The idea that this guard, this uniformed employee, would dare to suggest she follow standard protocols was almost incomprehensible. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "I'm not here as a regular tourist. I have personal relationships with members of the royal household. Lord Patterson specifically told me that arrangements would be made for a private viewing of areas not normally accessible to the public." James shifted nervously behind her, clearly recognizing the warning signs that anyone who had worked with Margaret for more than a week learned to identify. When her voice took on that particular tone, when her posture straightened in that specific way, trouble was about to follow. Thomas remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged. "I understand your situation, madam, but I'm not authorized to make exceptions to our security and visitor protocols. The Visitor Services Office will be able to verify any arrangements and provide appropriate assistance." What happened next would be talked about among the palace guard for months to come. Margaret's carefully maintained composure cracked like ice on a warming pond. The idea that this uniformed man, this mere guard, would continue to obstruct her path was beyond her comprehension. She had attended dinner parties where cabinet ministers hung on her every word. She had been personally thanked by royalty for her charitable contributions. She had connections that could make or break careers. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" she snapped, her voice rising loud enough to attract the attention of nearby tourists. "I am Margaret Worthington. My husband's company employs over 10,000 people. We are personal friends with Lord Patterson, Lady Catherine Henley, and numerous other members of the aristocracy. I have attended private functions at Buckingham Palace itself." Thomas had heard variations of this speech before, though rarely delivered with such vehement conviction. His military training kicked in, the same mental discipline that had kept him alive during combat operations in hostile territory. He recognized this as a test of his professionalism, his duty, and his commitment to the protocols he had sworn to uphold. The gathering crowd of tourists had stopped their sightseeing to watch this unexpected drama unfold. Camera phones appeared, though their owners tried to be discreet about recording what was clearly becoming an incident. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, asking why the fancy lady was shouting at the guard. Margaret seemed completely oblivious to the growing audience. Her entire focus was on this obstinate guard who refused to acknowledge her obvious importance. In her mind, this was simply a matter of making him understand who he was dealing with. Once he grasped her status, surely he would apologize and immediately escort her to wherever she wanted to go. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice growing even louder, "I'll have you know that my charitable foundation has donated substantial sums to various royal causes. We are not some random tourists off the street. We deserve and expect appropriate treatment." Thomas could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching this confrontation, but his training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. He had faced down armed insurgents in Afghanistan who had been genuinely trying to kill him. One angry wealthy woman, regardless of her connections or her volume, was not going to shake his composure. "Madam," he said, his voice remaining perfectly level and respectful, "I appreciate your frustration, but I am required to follow established security protocols without exception. These procedures exist for the safety and security of all visitors as well as the royal family themselves. I'm sure you can understand the importance of maintaining these standards." This response, so reasonable and logical, somehow made Margaret even angrier. She was not accustomed to having her anger met with calm professionalism. Usually, her displays of displeasure resulted in immediate capitulation and frantic efforts to appease her. James made a desperate attempt to defuse the situation before it escalated further. "Mrs. Worthington, perhaps if we just spoke with the Visitor Services Office as the gentleman suggested, we could clarify any misunderstanding about the arrangements." Margaret spun on him with the fury of someone whose authority was being questioned by her own staff. "James, be quiet. I am handling this." She turned back to Thomas, and, for a moment, something almost like cunning flickered in her eyes. She had spent years navigating social and business situations through a combination of charm, pressure, and strategic name-dropping. Surely this guard could be managed through the right approach. "Look," she said, attempting to inject a note of reasonableness into her voice while simultaneously making it clear that she was making a generous concession, "I understand you have your job to do. But surely you have supervisors who can authorize exceptions for special circumstances. I'm simply asking to speak with someone who has the authority to recognize legitimate special requests." Thomas recognized this as a classic escalation tactic, an attempt to find someone higher up the chain who might be more susceptible to pressure or intimidation. It was a strategy that probably worked in many situations, but Margaret had chosen the wrong institution and the wrong person to test it on. The Queen's Guard operated under protocols that had been refined over centuries. These weren't arbitrary rules designed to frustrate visitors, they were carefully crafted security procedures designed to protect both the royal family and the public. Every guard understood that these protocols existed because history had proven their necessity. "Madam, if you would like to make a formal complaint or request an exception to standard procedures, you can certainly do so through the appropriate channels. The Visitor Services Office can provide you with the correct forms and procedures for such requests." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. This man was actually telling her to fill out forms. Forms! As if she were some ordinary person making an ordinary request. The sheer audacity of it left her momentarily speechless. The crowd of observers had grown larger, with tourists from various countries watching this uniquely British confrontation unfold. Many of them had come to Windsor Castle specifically to see the famous guards, though they probably hadn't expected to witness anything quite like this. Margaret's face was beginning to flush red, a warning sign that James recognized with growing alarm. He had seen this progression before, and he knew that once Margaret reached a certain level of anger, her judgment became seriously impaired. She would say and do things that she would later rationalize as justified, but which usually left considerable damage in their wake. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Margaret declared, her voice now carrying across the courtyard. "I am not going to be treated like some common tourist by a mere guard. I demand to speak with your commanding officer immediately." Thomas maintained his position and his composure, though internally he was calculating how much longer this confrontation was likely to continue before it either resolved itself or required additional intervention. His training had taught him to recognize the escalation patterns of confrontational situations, and this one was definitely escalating rather than de-escalating. "Madam, if you wish to file a formal complaint, the Visitor Services Office can provide you with the appropriate procedures and contact information." The repetition of this response, so maddeningly consistent and professional, seemed to break something inside Margaret's carefully maintained self-control. She had been raised to believe that persistence and righteous indignation would eventually wear down any opposition. The idea that this guard would simply continue to repeat the same response, unmoved by her obvious distress and growing anger, was incomprehensible to her. What she failed to understand was that Thomas had been trained to maintain his composure under circumstances far more challenging than an angry tourist. His military service had taught him that consistency, professionalism, and adherence to duty were not just job requirements but moral imperatives. The uniform he wore represented something larger than himself, and he would not allow anyone to compromise that representation, regardless of their wealth, connections, or volume. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test both Margaret's sense of entitlement and Thomas's commitment to duty. Neither of them could have predicted how dramatically this encounter was about to escalate, or how it would ultimately become a story that would be remembered and retold for years to come. As Margaret prepared to make her next move in this battle of wills, the tourists continued to gather, their cameras ready to capture whatever happened next. Little did any of them know that they were about to witness one of the most spectacular displays of entitlement meeting immovable professionalism in Windsor Castle's long history. Margaret Worthington's face had progressed from its usual porcelain perfection to an alarming shade of red that clashed violently with her carefully chosen outfit. The gathering crowd of tourists, initially drawn by curiosity, now watched in fascination as this well-dressed woman appeared to be having what could only be described as a public meltdown in front of one of Britain's most famous landmarks. What the observers couldn't see was the internal battle raging within Margaret's mind. For over 50 years, she had navigated the world with the absolute certainty that her social status, her wealth, and her connections would open any door and solve any problem. She had never encountered a situation where these tools failed her so completely. The guard's continued professionalism in the face of her obvious displeasure wasn't just frustrating, it was a direct challenge to her entire understanding of how the world worked. James, her assistant, had retreated to what he hoped was a safe distance, though he remained close enough to intervene if the situation deteriorated further. He had worked for several wealthy families before joining Margaret's household, and he had learned that explosive confrontations were often followed by equally explosive recriminations. In his mind, he was already calculating whether this incident would result in his termination, and, if so, how quickly he could find alternative employment. Thomas, meanwhile, maintained his position with the kind of military bearing that had been drilled into him through years of training. His breathing remained controlled, his posture unchanged, his expression professionally neutral. To an outside observer, he might have appeared unaffected by the growing tension, but his mind was actively assessing the situation and preparing for various potential outcomes. The tourists surrounding them represented a fascinating cross-section of international observers. There were American families on their European vacation, Japanese visitors who had traveled halfway around the world to see the famous British traditions, European tourists from various countries, and British nationals who were witnessing this confrontation with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination. Many of them had their phones out, though they tried to be discreet about recording what was clearly becoming a viral-worthy moment. In the age of social media, everyone understood that moments like this could become internet sensations within hours. What they were witnessing wasn't just an argument, it was a collision between old-world privilege and modern accountability. Margaret seemed suddenly to realize that her previous approach wasn't working. The guard hadn't been intimidated by her name-dropping, impressed by her obvious wealth, or swayed by her growing anger. It was time, in her mind, to escalate to more serious measures. "Fine," she announced, her voice carrying a tone of grim satisfaction, as if she were about to deploy a weapon that would finally end this frustrating resistance. "Since you refuse to show appropriate respect for distinguished visitors, I'll simply have to make some phone calls that will clarify your responsibilities." She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew what appeared to be a very expensive smartphone. The movement was performed with theatrical precision, as if she were drawing a sword that would finally cut through this guard's inexplicable stubbornness. "Lord Patterson will be very interested to hear about how visitors with confirmed arrangements are being treated," she continued, her fingers moving across the phone screen with obvious familiarity. "I'm quite certain that once he speaks with your superiors, you'll find yourself with a much clearer understanding of how to properly handle distinguished guests." Thomas watched this performance with the same steady calm he had maintained throughout the encounter. His military training had taught him that threats, whether subtle or overt, were often the last resort of people who had run out of legitimate options. In his experience, people who actually possessed the kind of influence Margaret was claiming rarely felt the need to announce it so dramatically. The crowd of tourists was growing larger, and Thomas could see some of them pointing and whispering to each other. He understood that this situation was becoming a spectacle, but his duty required him to maintain his position and his professionalism regardless of the number of observers or the volume of Margaret's complaints. Margaret's phone call was clearly intended to be overheard. She spoke loudly enough for everyone within 30 feet to catch every word, and her tone suggested someone who was accustomed to having her calls answered immediately by important people. "Patricia, it's Margaret Worthington. I need to speak with Lord Patterson immediately about a very serious situation at Windsor Castle." She paused, apparently listening to a response. "Yes, I know he's in meetings, but this is urgent. I'm being deliberately obstructed by palace staff despite confirmed arrangements." There was another pause, during which Margaret's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching concern. Thomas noticed the change, though his expression remained unchanged. He had observed enough bluffing during his military service to recognize when someone's certainty was beginning to crack. "What do you mean he's unavailable for the rest of the week?" Margaret's voice rose slightly, losing some of its theatrical authority. "This is important, Patricia. I specifically discussed this with him at the Henley charity event." The pause that followed this statement was longer and more uncomfortable. Margaret's face began to show the first signs of uncertainty, though she clearly wasn't ready to abandon her strategy entirely. "Well, then, have him call me as soon as possible. This is completely unacceptable." She ended the call with more force than necessary and immediately began dialing another number. James watched this performance with growing alarm. He had seen Margaret deploy her network of connections before, usually with devastating effectiveness. The fact that her first call hadn't produced immediate results was concerning, but her decision to continue calling other contacts in full view of a growing crowd of observers was potentially catastrophic. Thomas remained motionless, though he was acutely aware that Margaret's public display was creating a situation that might require additional intervention. His radio remained clipped to his uniform, ready for use if the situation escalated beyond his ability to manage alone. Margaret's second call followed a similar pattern, though this time her voice carried a note of desperation that she was trying unsuccessfully to disguise as righteous indignation. "Catherine, darling, it's Margaret. I'm having the most appalling experience at Windsor Castle, and I need your help." Another pause. "What do you mean you don't know anything about special arrangements?" "I specifically mentioned this to Lord Patterson, and he said accommodations would be made." The conversation continued for several minutes, during which Margaret's growing frustration became increasingly obvious to everyone watching. Her carefully maintained composure was cracking like expensive veneer under pressure, revealing something much less attractive underneath. By the time she ended the second call, the crowd of tourists had grown to include several dozen people, and someone had apparently notified castle security because Thomas could see additional personnel approaching from the direction of the main buildings. Margaret made 3 more calls in rapid succession, each one following a similar pattern of increasing desperation disguised as outraged authority. With each conversation, it became more apparent that whatever arrangements she believed had been made simply didn't exist in any official capacity. "This is impossible," she finally declared, lowering her phone and staring at Thomas as if he were personally responsible for her contact's failure to immediately solve her problem. "There has obviously been some sort of miscommunication, but that doesn't excuse your complete lack of courtesy and professionalism." Thomas recognized this as an attempt to shift blame and maintain dignity in the face of an increasingly obvious failure. In his experience, people who found themselves in untenable positions often became more rather than less aggressive as their options diminished. "Madam," he replied with the same professional courtesy he had maintained throughout the encounter, "I understand your frustration, but my responsibilities require me to follow established procedures without exception. I'm certain that the Visitor Services Office can help clarify any confusion about arrangements or provide information about scheduling future visits." This response, so maddeningly reasonable and consistent, seemed to push Margaret past her breaking point. The combination of her failed phone calls, the growing crowd of observers, and this guard's continued resistance had created a perfect storm of wounded pride and frustrated entitlement. "Don't you dare tell me about procedures," she snapped, her voice now carrying across the entire courtyard. "I have been coming to events at royal residences since before you were born. I have personally met members of the royal family. I have donated more money to royal charities than you will earn in your entire lifetime." The crowd watched in fascination as this elegantly dressed woman seemed to be dissolving before their eyes. What had started as an impressive display of confidence and authority had devolved into something that looked increasingly desperate and unhinged. James finally summoned the courage to approach his employer, though he did so with the careful movements of someone approaching a volatile explosive device. "Mrs. Worthington," he said quietly, "perhaps we should consider rescheduling for another time when the arrangements can be properly confirmed." Margaret turned on him with the fury of someone whose last hope of maintaining dignity was being threatened by her own staff. "James, I told you to be quiet. I am handling this situation." Her voice carried a warning that anyone who had worked in service positions would immediately recognize and respect. James retreated again, but not before Thomas caught a glimpse of genuine sympathy in the young man's eyes. It was clear that he understood exactly what kind of person he worked for, and equally clear that he had seen this type of scene play out before. The arrival of additional castle security marked a new phase in the confrontation. Thomas could see Sergeant Williams approaching, a 20-year veteran whose presence always brought a sense of calm authority to any situation. The sergeant had earned his position through a combination of military experience, diplomatic skill, and an encyclopedic knowledge of palace protocols. Margaret noticed the approaching security personnel and seemed to interpret their arrival as vindication of her position. Surely these were the supervisors she had been demanding to speak with, the people who would finally recognize her importance and override this stubborn guard's obstruction. Finally, she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, someone with actual authority. "I've been trying to explain to your guard here that there's been some sort of misunderstanding about my arrangements, and he's been completely unhelpful." Sergeant Williams approached with the measured pace of someone who had dealt with hundreds of similar situations over the course of his career. His expression revealed nothing as he assessed the scene: the angry woman in expensive clothes, the nervous assistant, the professional guard maintaining his position, and the crowd of tourists who had become unwilling witnesses to an increasingly dramatic confrontation. "Good morning," Sergeant Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of leadership experience. "I understand there's been some confusion about visitor arrangements. Perhaps I can help clarify the situation." Margaret's face lit up with relief and vindication. This was exactly what she had been waiting for, someone who would finally understand her position and resolve this ridiculous obstruction. "Yes, exactly," she said, her voice regaining some of its original confidence. "I'm Margaret Worthington, and I have confirmed arrangements for a private tour of areas not normally accessible to the public. Your guard here has been completely unreasonable in refusing to acknowledge these arrangements." Sergeant Williams nodded thoughtfully, maintaining an expression of professional interest while his experienced eyes took in every detail of the situation. He had handled countless VIP requests over the years, and he knew exactly what legitimate arrangements looked like versus what they were dealing with here. "I see," he replied diplomatically. "And could you provide me with the confirmation information for these arrangements? Perhaps a reference number or documentation from our visitor services office?" Margaret's confident expression faltered slightly. In all her years of using her connections to bypass normal procedures, she had never actually needed to provide formal documentation. Her name, her bearing, and her obvious wealth had always been sufficient. "Well, the arrangements were made verbally through Lord Patterson," she said, though her voice carried less certainty than before. "I didn't realize that formal documentation would be necessary for someone of my standing." Sergeant Williams maintained his diplomatic expression while internally noting that this was exactly the response he had expected. Legitimate VIP visits always involved extensive documentation, security clearances, and advance coordination. The idea that someone could simply show up and expect special access based on claimed verbal arrangements was not how royal security operated in the modern world. "I understand," he said carefully. "Unfortunately, for security reasons, all special access arrangements must be coordinated in advance through our official channels with proper documentation and security clearances. I'm sure you can understand the importance of maintaining these procedures." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Even this supervisor, this person with obvious authority, was giving her the same response as the guard. It was as if the entire palace staff had conspired to ignore her obvious importance and treat her like some ordinary tourist. The crowd of observers sensed that the confrontation was reaching a critical moment. Camera phones remained discreetly active, capturing what many of them realized would be a story they would tell for years to come. What happened next would transform this encounter from a simple miscommunication into a viral sensation that would be discussed across social media platforms around the world. Margaret was about to make a choice that would define not only this moment but her reputation for years to come. The moment that would define this entire encounter arrived with the sudden clarity of lightning cutting through storm clouds. Margaret Worthington, faced with the complete failure of every strategy she had ever used to get her way, made a decision that would haunt her for months to come. Instead of accepting the reasonable explanations she had been given, instead of recognizing that perhaps her assumed arrangements didn't actually exist, instead of maintaining even a shred of the dignity that her expensive clothes and jewelry were meant to project, Margaret chose to escalate in the most dramatic way possible. "This is absolutely outrageous," she screamed, her voice echoing off the ancient stone walls of Windsor Castle with such force that tourists several hundred yards away turned to see what was happening. "I will not be treated this way by servants." The word servants hung in the air like a slap. Every person within earshot, from the palace guards to the tourists to the castle staff, understood exactly what Margaret had revealed about her worldview with that single word. These weren't public servants protecting a national treasure; in her mind, they were personal servants who existed to accommodate her wishes. Thomas felt the insult hit him like a physical blow, though his expression remained unchanged. He had served his country in combat zones, risking his life to protect the freedoms that allowed people like Margaret to live in safety and security. He had earned his position through merit, dedication, and sacrifice. To be called a servant by someone whose only qualification was inherited wealth struck at the core of his professional pride. Sergeant Williams' expression hardened almost imperceptibly. In his 20 years of service, he had dealt with entitled visitors before, but the open disrespect Margaret was displaying crossed a line that even diplomacy couldn't ignore. The crowd of tourists reacted with a collective intake of breath. Many of them came from countries where such open class-based contempt was considered deeply offensive. American visitors, in particular, found themselves witnessing exactly the kind of aristocratic arrogance their ancestors had fought a revolution to escape. James, Margaret's assistant, closed his eyes in what appeared to be physical pain. He had seen Margaret angry before, but he had never seen her so completely lose control of her public persona. He knew that whatever happened next, this moment was being recorded by dozens of phones and would likely be shared across the internet within hours. But Margaret was far from finished. The failure of her phone calls, the professional resistance of the guards, and the growing realization that her usual methods weren't working had pushed her into a state of rage that consumed all of her judgment. "Do you people have any idea what kind of connections I have?" she continued, her voice growing even louder. "I can have all of you fired with a single phone call. My husband's business relationships include members of parliament. We have dinner with people who could end your pathetic careers with a word." The tourists watched in horrified fascination as this well-dressed woman seemed to be having a complete breakdown in front of them. Some of them had come to Windsor Castle hoping to see British traditions and pageantry, but they certainly hadn't expected to witness such a spectacular display of entitled rage. Thomas maintained his position, though every instinct honed through military training was telling him to respond to what was clearly becoming a direct challenge to his authority and dignity. His hands remained at his sides, his breathing stayed controlled, and his expression gave away nothing of the anger building inside him. Sergeant Williams stepped forward slightly, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond normal visitor complaints into something that might require more direct intervention. His years of experience had taught him to recognize when someone had crossed the line from frustrated to potentially dangerous. "Madam," Sergeant Williams said, his voice carrying a note of steel beneath the diplomatic courtesy, "I'm going to need to ask you to lower your voice and conduct yourself in a manner appropriate for a royal residence." This request, so reasonable and professional, seemed to inflame Margaret's anger even further. In her mind, she was being told how to behave by people who should be grateful for her presence. The idea that staff at a place she considered herself entitled to visit would dare to correct her behavior was incomprehensible. "Don't you dare tell me how to behave," she shrieked, taking a step closer to Sergeant Williams in a way that immediately put both guards on high alert. "I know how to conduct myself in royal residences better than you ever will. I've been attending functions at Buckingham Palace since before you were even born. The claim about Buckingham Palace functions was almost certainly an exaggeration at best, but, in her current state of rage, Margaret seemed to believe that volume and repetition would somehow make her statements more convincing. What she failed to notice was that her aggressive movement towards Sergeant Williams had triggered subtle but significant changes in the body language of both guards. Thomas had shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, positioning himself to respond quickly if Margaret's verbal aggression escalated to physical action. Sergeant Williams had moved his hand closer to his radio, ready to call for additional support if necessary. The crowd of tourists sensed the growing tension, and several families with young children began moving farther away from what was clearly becoming a volatile situation. The adults who remained were watching with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents or natural disasters. Margaret seemed completely oblivious to the effect her behavior was having on everyone around her. Her entire focus was on these two guards who refused to acknowledge her obvious superiority and grant her the special treatment she knew she deserved. "I want to speak with the Lord Chamberlain immediately," she demanded, apparently under the impression that invoking the highest levels of the royal household would finally break through their resistance. "I want to speak with whoever is in charge of this entire place right now." Thomas and Sergeant Williams exchanged a quick glance, communicating volumes through years of working together. Both men understood that Margaret's demands had now crossed into the realm of complete fantasy. The idea that the Lord Chamberlain, one of the most senior officials in the royal household, would interrupt his duties to deal with a tourist complaint was so absurd it would have been funny under other circumstances. "Madam," Sergeant Williams replied with infinite patience, "the appropriate channels for addressing visitor concerns are through our guest services office. They can provide you with the correct procedures for filing any complaints or requests." The repetition of this information, which Margaret had now heard multiple times from different sources, "See me picture this, you're standing in front of one of the world's most prestigious palaces, camera in hand, ready to capture that perfect vacation photo. The sun is shining, tourists are chatting excitedly, and everything seems perfect. Then, suddenly, a woman's voice cuts through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife through silk. Do you know who I am? I demand to speak to your supervisor immediately." What happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about privilege, power, and the quiet heroes who protect our most sacred spaces. This isn't just another entitled tourist story. This is about the moment when someone's carefully constructed world of self-importance collides with the unbreakable wall of duty, honor, and respect. Some encounters change people forever. Some moments become legends whispered among colleagues for years to come. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person who thinks they hold all the power discovers they've picked the wrong fight with the wrong person on the wrong day. You're about to witness one of those moments. Get comfortable, because what you're about to hear will make you want to applaud, gasp, and share this story with everyone you know. This is the true account of how one palace guard's perfect response to an impossible situation became the stuff of legend. Are you ready to discover what happens when unstoppable entitlement meets immovable duty? Let's dive in.